The winter fog rolled through the gates of Windsor Castle like a thick blanket, hiding secrets that no one dared to speak aloud. Inside the grand halls, a young guard named Thomas Bennet stood at his post, his hands trembling slightly beneath his white gloves. He had been awake all night, not because of his duty, but because of a decision that could cost him everything. In just a few hours, he would do something no one had ever done before. He would tell Queen Victoria a truth that everyone else was too afraid to say. Before we continue with this incredible story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss stories like this one. These are the moments history forgot. They deserve to be remembered. Thomas had served in the Queen's Guard for 3 years. He was 24 years old, tall and strong, with dark hair and honest blue eyes. His father had been a soldier, and his grandfather before that. Serving the Queen was supposed to be the greatest honor of his life. But lately, Thomas had seen things that troubled his heart. Things that made him question whether silence was really loyalty, or just cowardice dressed up in a fancy uniform. The castle was preparing for a grand celebration. Queen Victoria was planning to announce a new policy that would affect thousands of working families across England. Her advisors had convinced her it was the right decision. They had shown her reports and numbers that made everything look perfect. But Thomas knew the truth. He had seen it with his own eyes during his leave time when he visited his hometown in the countryside. 3 weeks earlier, Thomas had gone home to see his sick mother. The small village where he grew up had changed in terrible ways. Families were struggling to put food on their tables. Children were working in factories instead of playing in the fields. The new policy the Queen was about to announce would make things even worse. It would raise taxes on the poorest people while giving more benefits to the wealthy landowners. Thomas had walked through the muddy streets of his village and seen faces he barely recognized. Old friends looked tired and beaten down. His own mother, who had once been so full of life, now looked 10 years older than she was. She coughed constantly from the damp and cold in their small cottage. They could barely afford coal to keep warm. When Thomas asked the village people what they thought about the Queen, they fell silent. Some looked down at their feet. Others walked away. Finally, an old farmer named Mr. Whitmore pulled Thomas aside. The old man's hands were rough and scarred from a lifetime of hard work. The farmer spoke in a quiet voice, looking around to make sure no one else could hear. He told Thomas that people were angry. They felt forgotten and ignored. The Queen lived in her beautiful castles, while they lived in houses that leaked when it rained. The Queen's advisors only talked to rich people who told them what they wanted to hear. No one was telling the Queen what life was really like for ordinary people. Thomas tried to defend the Queen. Surely she would help if she knew the truth. But Mr. Whitmore just shook his head sadly. He said the Queen was surrounded by people who lied to keep their positions. They painted a pretty picture of England so she would keep them in their comfortable jobs. The truth was locked outside the castle walls. Those words haunted Thomas as he traveled back to Windsor. He kept thinking about his mother's tired eyes and the hungry children he had seen. He thought about all the families who were suffering while the Queen's advisors praised themselves for doing such a wonderful job. Someone needed to tell her the truth. But who would dare? For days, Thomas wrestled with his conscience. Speaking to the Queen directly was forbidden. A simple guard did not approach royalty without permission. If he broke this rule, he would be dismissed immediately. He might even be arrested. His family depended on his income. His mother needed the money he sent home each month for her medicine. But every time Thomas closed his eyes, he saw those faces from his village. He heard Mr. Whitmore's words again and again. If everyone stayed silent because they were afraid, nothing would ever change. The Queen would announce her policy, and thousands of families would suffer even more. Could Thomas really stand by and let that happen? He began to form a plan. It was dangerous and probably foolish, but it was the only way. In 2 days, the Queen would walk through the East Gallery on her way to the celebration. Thomas was assigned to guard duty in that very corridor. For just a few moments, he would be alone with her. It would be his only chance. The night before the Queen's walk, Thomas wrote a letter to his mother. He did not tell her what he was planning to do, but he told her he loved her and that he was trying to do the right thing. He told her to be proud of him, no matter what happened, He sealed the letter and gave it to his friend William, another guard, with instructions to mail it if anything went wrong. Now, as the morning sun tried to break through the winter fog, Thomas stood at his post, his heart hammered in his chest. Down the hallway, he could hear footsteps approaching. The Queen was coming. In just a few moments, he would either change history or destroy his own life. Perhaps both. He straightened his uniform and took a deep breath. His hands stopped trembling. He had made his choice. Whatever happened next, he would finally speak the truth that everyone else was too afraid to say. The question that burned in his mind was simple but terrifying. Would Queen Victoria listen, or would she have him thrown in prison for his boldness? The footsteps grew louder. Thomas could see the Queen's silhouette emerging from the fog of the corridor. His moment had arrived. Queen Victoria walked with the grace of someone who had worn a crown for many years. Her black dress rustled softly against the polished floor. She was in mourning, as she had been for years since her beloved husband Prince Albert had died. Her face was stern, but not unkind. Two ladies in waiting followed several steps behind her, whispering quietly to each other. Thomas felt his throat go dry. He had practiced what he would say 1,000 times in his head, but now that the moment was here, every word seemed to vanish. He was supposed to stand perfectly still, eyes forward, saying nothing. That was the rule. That was what every guard did. But if he followed the rules, nothing would change. The Queen drew closer. Thomas could see the details of her face now. She looked tired. There were dark circles under her eyes. She carried herself with dignity, but there was a sadness in her expression that made her seem human rather than royal. For just a second, Thomas wondered if he was making a terrible mistake. But then he remembered the children in his village with their thin faces and ragged clothes. He remembered his mother coughing in their cold cottage. He remembered Mr. Whitmore's words about how no one told the Queen the truth. Thomas knew that if he stayed silent now, he would regret it for the rest of his life. As the Queen passed directly in front of him, Thomas did something that shocked everyone in the corridor. He stepped forward and spoke. His voice came out stronger than he expected. He addressed her properly, using all the correct titles, but his words were bold and direct. He told her that he needed to speak with her about something urgent, something that concerned the welfare of her people. The ladies in waiting gasped. One of them rushed forward to push Thomas back into position. The other began calling for the senior guards to arrest this insolent soldier who had dared to break protocol. But Queen Victoria held up her hand, and everyone froze. She looked at Thomas with sharp, intelligent eyes. For a long moment, she said nothing. Thomas felt as if she could see right through him, reading every thought in his head. His career was over. He knew that. But at least he had tried. Then the Queen spoke. Her voice was not angry, but it was firm and commanding. She asked Thomas his name and how long he had served in her guard. Thomas answered honestly, his voice steady despite his racing heart. She asked him what was so important that he would break every rule to speak to her. Thomas knew he had only seconds before the senior. Guards arrived to drag him away. He spoke quickly but clearly. He told the Queen that he had just returned from his village in the countryside. He described what he had seen there. The poverty, the hunger, the families struggling to survive. He told her about the new policy she was planning to announce, and how it would hurt the very people who needed help the most. The ladies in waiting tried to interrupt, telling the Queen that this was inappropriate and that the guards should be removed immediately. But Victoria raised her hand again, silencing them. She kept her eyes fixed on Thomas. She asked him how he knew about the policy. It had not been announced publicly yet. Thomas explained that people in the villages heard things. Rumors spread. The poor might not have money or power, but they had ears. They heard about what was being planned, and they were afraid. They felt that no one at the palace understood their lives or cared about their suffering. The Queen's expression changed slightly. Something flickered across her face. Was it anger? Surprise? Thomas could not tell. She asked him if he truly believed that she did not care about her people. Her voice was quieter now, almost hurt. Thomas chose his words carefully. He said that he believed the Queen had a good heart, but he also believed that she was surrounded by people who only told her what she wanted to hear. Her advisors showed her reports that made everything look fine. They took her on tours where she only saw happy, prosperous areas. They kept her away from the real suffering that existed in the forgotten corners of England. One of the senior guards finally arrived, out of breath from running. He immediately moved to grab Thomas, apologizing profusely to the Queen for this disgraceful incident. He assured her that the guard would be dealt with severely. But once again, Victoria stopped him. She told the senior guard to wait. She turned back to Thomas and asked him a direct question. She asked if he was willing to show her what he had seen, to take her to his village and let her see the truth with her own eyes. Everyone in the corridor seemed to stop breathing. The ladies in waiting looked horrified. The senior guard seemed confused. This was not how things were done. Queens did not go wandering into poor villages based on the word of a common soldier. Thomas felt a surge of hope mixed with fear. Was she serious? Or was this some kind of trap? He looked into her eyes and saw something there that surprised him, curiosity and perhaps a hint of doubt about the people who surrounded her. He told the Queen that he would be honored to show her his village if she truly wanted to see it, but he warned her that it would not be pleasant. She would see things that would disturb her, things that her advisors had worked hard to hide from her view. Victoria stood very still for a moment. Everyone waited to see what she would decide. The senior guard began to speak, trying to convince her that this was a bad idea. The ladies in waiting agreed, saying it was dangerous and improper. But the Queen ignored them all. She made her decision. She would go to Thomas's village, but not in her royal carriage, with her full entourage. She would travel quietly, with only a small group. She would dress simply so as not to draw attention. She wanted to see what her people's lives were really like when they did not know the Queen was watching. The senior guard tried to protest, but Victoria's voice became sharp. She reminded him that she was the Queen, and she would go where she pleased. If her people were suffering as Thomas claimed, then she needed to see it. How could she rule wisely if she did not know the truth? Thomas felt dizzy with disbelief. Was this really happening? Had he actually convinced Queen Victoria to visit his village? The senior guard looked at him with barely concealed fury. Thomas knew he had made enemies today, but he had also done something remarkable. He had gotten through to the Queen when everyone said it was impossible. Victoria told Thomas that they would leave in 2 days. That would give her time to make arrangements without alerting her advisors to what she was doing. She instructed him to tell no one about their conversation or their plans. If word got out, the trip would be cancelled. As the Queen walked away, Thomas stood frozen in place. His legs felt weak. He had expected to be arrested, maybe even imprisoned. Instead, he had somehow convinced the most powerful woman in England to see the truth. But now came the hard part. In 2 days, the Queen would see his village. She would see the poverty and suffering. And Thomas would have to face whatever came next. The next 2 days felt like the longest of Thomas's life. He went about his duties as usual, but his mind was spinning. What had he done? He had convinced the Queen to visit his village, but now he worried about what she would find there. If things had gotten better since his last visit, what if the Queen thought he had exaggerated? Worse, what if things were even more terrible than he remembered, and she blamed him for not speaking up sooner? Thomas could not tell anyone about the plan, not even his fellow guards. The Queen had been clear about keeping it secret, but keeping such a huge secret was torture. His friend William noticed that something was wrong. I asked Thomas several times if he was feeling ill or if something bad had happened. Thomas could only shake his head and change the subject. On the morning of the 3rd day, Thomas received a message. He was to report to a side entrance of the castle at dawn. He barely slept that night. When the first light appeared in the sky, he dressed in his civilian clothes and made his way to the designated spot. A plain black carriage waited in the shadows. It looked like something a merchant might use, nothing fancy or royal. The driver was a serious-looking man who said nothing as Thomas approached. The door opened, and Thomas climbed inside. Queen Victoria was already seated, dressed in simple dark clothing, with a heavy cloak and a veil that covered most of her face. Thomas almost did not recognize her. She looked like an ordinary widow, the kind you might see in any town. Beside her sat an older woman Thomas had never seen before. The Queen introduced her as Mrs. Fletcher, her most trusted companion who had served the royal family for 30 years. The Queen's voice was quiet but firm. She told Thomas that they were taking a great risk by doing this. If her advisors found out, there would be consequences for everyone involved. But she had thought about their conversation for 2 days and nights, and she could not shake the feeling that he had told her something important, something she needed to see for herself. The carriage began to move. They traveled through the early morning streets of London, then out into the countryside. The journey would take several hours. Inside the carriage, the Queen asked Thomas questions. She wanted to know about his life, his family, and his village. Thomas told her about growing up as the son of a soldier. His father had died when Thomas was 12, leaving his mother to raise him and his 2 younger sisters alone. They had been poor, but they had been happy. His mother had worked as a seamstress, and Thomas had helped by doing odd jobs for the local farmers. He described how things had changed over the past few years. Tea factories had opened, but they paid very little. The old ways of farming were being replaced by machines that only the wealthy could afford. Small farmers were losing their land to big landowners. People who had worked the same land for generations were being forced into cities to work in terrible conditions. The Queen listened quietly. Sometimes she asked questions. Sometimes she just stared out the window at the passing countryside. Mrs. Fletcher sat with her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. As they traveled further from London, the scenery changed. The neat, prosperous farms near the city gave way to more run-down areas. Thomas saw things he had seen on his last trip home: cottages with broken windows, fields that looked neglected. Groups of thin, tired-looking men walking along the road, probably searching for work. The Queen noticed too. Thomas saw her eyes widen slightly as she looked at a group of children playing in the mud outside a shabby cottage. They wore clothes that were more patches than original fabric. One child had no shoes, even though the ground was cold and wet. They reached Thomas's village in the late morning. The carriage stopped on the outskirts, near a small church. Suggested they walk through the village rather than riding through it. The Queen agreed. She pulled her veil lower over her face and stepped out of the carriage. The village looked even worse than Thomas remembered. Perhaps it was because he was seeing it through the Queen's eyes now. The main street was muddy and full of potholes. Many of the shop windows were dirty or cracked. An old dog lay sleeping in the middle of the road, too tired or hungry to move. They walked slowly. The Queen said nothing, but Thomas could feel the tension coming from her. Mrs. Fletcher stayed. Close to her side, one hand on the Queen's arm, as if to steady her. Thomas led them past the old bakery where he used to buy bread as a child. It was closed now, the windows dark and empty. The baker had gone out of business 6 months ago. Next door, the butcher's shop was still open, but the window displayed very little meat. What was there looked expensive. An old woman sat on a bench outside her cottage, mending a shirt. Her fingers moved slowly, stiff with age and cold. She looked up as they passed and nodded politely. She did not recognize the Queen. To her, they were just travelers passing through. Thomas showed them the school where he had learned to read and write. It was still standing, but barely. The roof had holes in it. Through the window, they could see children sitting on broken benches, sharing books because there were not enough for everyone. The teacher, a thin young woman with tired eyes, was trying to keep order in the cold room. The Queen stopped and stared at the school for a long time. Thomas heard her whisper something to Mrs. Fletcher, but he could not make out the words. When they started walking again, the Queen's steps seemed heavier somehow. They passed the factory at the edge of town. It was a dark, ugly building that belched black smoke into the sky. The noise of the machines inside was deafening. Thomas explained that many people from the village worked there now. They worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week, for wages that were barely enough to survive on. As if to prove his point, the factory bell rang. It was time for the workers' short, midday break. Men and women poured out of the building, coughing and rubbing their eyes. Their faces were covered in soot. Their clothes were dirty and torn. They looked exhausted. One of the workers was Thomas's neighbor, Mr. Davies. He had been a proud farmer once, but he had lost his land when he could not pay his debts. Now he worked in the factory. He looked 20 years older than his age. When he saw Thomas, he smiled weakly and waved. Then he sat down on the ground right where he was and pulled out a small piece of bread for his meal. The Queen watched all of this in silence. Thomas glanced at her face and saw that her eyes were shining with tears. Mrs. Fletcher had gone pale. They were seeing the real England now, the England that existed far away from the palace and its beautiful gardens. Thomas finally led them to his mother's cottage. It was small and shabby, with a leaking roof and drafty walls. He knocked on the door gently. His mother opened it, and her face lit up with surprise and joy when she saw her son. She hugged him tightly and noticed the two women with him. Thomas introduced them as Mrs. White and Mrs. Fletcher, travelers who wanted to see what life was like in the village. His mother, always kind, despite her hardships, welcomed them inside and offered them tea. She apologized for the state of her home, explaining that she could not afford repairs. The Queen sat at the small wooden table and accepted the tea with quiet thanks. Thomas watched as she looked around the cottage. She saw the buckets placed to catch rainwater from the leaking roof. She saw the thin blankets on the bed. She saw the nearly empty cupboard. She saw how Thomas's mother shivered despite wearing 2 shawls. Thomas's mother began to talk, not knowing who she was speaking to. She talked about how hard life had become, how the prices of food kept rising while wages stayed the same, how she worried about her daughters who had moved to London to work as maids because there was no future for them here, how she was grateful that Thomas had his position with the Queen's Guard, because at least one of her children had a secure job. The Queen listened to every word. She asked gentle questions. She wanted to know about the new policy that was going to be announced. Thomas's mother's face darkened. She had heard about it. Everyone in the village was talking about it. The new taxes would ruin them. They were already barely surviving. How could they pay more? Thomas saw a tear roll down the Queen's cheek. She quickly wiped it away, but he had seen it. Something was breaking inside her. The wall between the palace and the real world was crumbling. After leaving his mother's cottage, the Queen asked Thomas to show her more. She wanted to see everything. She wanted to understand the full picture of how her people were living. Mrs. Fletcher looked worried and suggested they return to the carriage. But Victoria shook her head. She had come this far. She would not turn back now. Thomas led them to the village square, where people gathered. It was market day, but the market was nothing like the bustling, cheerful markets near the palace. There were only a few stalls, and they held very little. Vegetables that were wilted and old, bread that looked hard and stale, a few eggs and some small pieces of meat. The prices shocked the Queen. Thomas heard her gasp quietly when she saw how much a simple loaf of bread cost. Mrs. Fletcher whispered that it was 3 times what they paid in London. But the real shock was seeing how the villagers had to carefully count their coins before buying anything. Women held tired babies on their hips while they tried to bargain for a few potatoes. Men stood in groups, talking in low voices about work that did not exist. An elderly man approached Thomas, recognizing him from his childhood. It was Mr. Whitmore, the old farmer who had first told Thomas about how people were afraid to speak the truth to the Queen. The old man's eyes were sunken, and he walked with a heavy limp now. He shook Thomas's hand warmly and asked how life was at the palace. Thomas made introductions carefully, keeping the Queen's identity secret. Mr. Whitmore was happy to talk to visitors. He had always been a friendly man, even in hard times. He invited them to sit on a bench near the old well. He began to tell them stories. He talked about how the village had been different when he was young. There had been plenty of work then. Farmers had owned their own land. Children had enough to eat. People had taken pride in their work and their homes. But everything had changed. Big landowners had bought up the small farms. Factories had come and taken the young people away from the land. The government had passed laws that helped the rich, but hurt the poor. Mr. Whitmore was not bitter as he spoke. He was just sad. He said that he did not blame the Queen personally. He believed she meant well. But he also believed that she did not know what was really happening. How could she? She lived in a palace surrounded by rich advisors who had never gone hungry a day in their lives. The Queen sat very still, listening to every word. At one point, she asked Mr. Whitmore what he would tell the Queen if he could speak to her directly. What would he want her to know? The old farmer thought for a long moment. Then he said that he would tell her that her people were not lazy or looking for handouts. They wanted to work. They wanted to take care of their families. They wanted to live with dignity. But the system was broken. The laws favored those who already had money and power. Ordinary people had no voice. They could vote, but their votes did not seem to change anything because the people in power did not listen to them. He would tell her that what people needed most was hope. They needed to believe that someone cared about them, that their lives mattered, that their struggles were seen and understood. Right now, many people felt forgotten and invisible. They felt that the Queen lived in a different world, a world that had nothing to do with their daily reality of cold houses and empty stomachs. The Queen's voice was thick with emotion when she thanked Mr. Whitmore for his honesty. The old man smiled and said that honesty was all he had left to give. He hoped the visitors would spread the word about what they had seen in the village. Maybe someone important would listen. As they walked away from Mr. Whitmore, the Queen stopped suddenly. She turned to Thomas and Mrs. Fletcher. Her voice was shaking when she spoke. She said that she had been blind. All these years, she had believed her advisors when they told her that England was prospering. She had believed the reports that showed progress and growth. She had trusted the people around her to tell her the truth, but they had lied to her. Not with false information, perhaps, but with incomplete information. They had shown her only what they wanted her to see. They had taken her to visit prosperous towns and successful factories. They had kept her away from places like this village. They had created a beautiful illusion while real people suffered in the shadows. Mrs. Fletcher spoke gently. She told the Queen that it was not entirely the fault of her advisors. Many of them truly did not know how bad things were. They lived comfortable lives in London and rarely ventured into the countryside. They saw numbers and reports, but did not see the faces behind those numbers. And some of them, the honest woman admitted, simply did not care. They were more interested in keeping their positions and pleasing the Queen than in telling her difficult truths. The Queen asked Thomas a direct question. She wanted to know why he had risked everything to tell her the truth. He could have kept his comfortable position as a guard. He could have ignored what he had seen in his village. Why had he spoken up? Thomas thought carefully before answering. He told the Queen that he had been raised to believe that serving her was the highest honor. But he had realized that true service did not mean just standing at attention and following orders. True service meant being brave enough to tell the truth, even when it was dangerous, even when it might cost him everything. He said that he loved England. He loved his village and his mother and all the people struggling to survive. If staying silent meant watching them suffer while he stood safely in his uniform, then his service meant nothing. He would rather lose his position and face punishment than live with the guilt of knowing he could have made a difference but chose not to. The Queen looked at Thomas, with something like admiration in her eyes. She told him that he had done what her own advisors had failed to do. He had shown her the truth. And now that she had seen it, she could not unsee it. She could not go back to her palace and pretend everything was fine. She had to do something. But what could she do? The new policy was already prepared. Her ministers had worked on it for months. Changing it now would be difficult. They would ask questions. They would want to know why she had suddenly changed her mind. If they discovered that she had taken this secret trip, there would be scandal. Her advisors would be furious. Some might even resign in protest. Thomas surprised himself with his boldness. He told the Queen that scandal and angry advisors were less important than doing what was right. If she truly wanted to help her people, she would have to be brave. She would have to be willing to face criticism and opposition. Change was never easy, especially when it challenged powerful people who benefited from keeping things the way they were. The Queen smiled slightly at that. She said that Thomas reminded her of her late husband, Prince Albert. He had always cared deeply about the welfare of the people. He had pushed for reforms that helped the poor and improved working conditions. After his death, she had been so lost in grief that she had withdrawn from those efforts. She had let her advisors handle everything while she mourned. Perhaps, she said quietly, it was time to honor Albert's memory by continuing his work, by fighting for the people who had no one else to fight for them. They returned to the carriage as the sun began to set. The journey back to London was quiet. The Queen stared out the window, lost in thought. Mrs. Fletcher held her hand. Thomas sat across from them, wondering what would happen next. He had shown the Queen the truth. She had seen the suffering of her people with her own eyes. She had promised to do something, but would she really be able to change things? Or would the powerful forces around her convince her to give up? Would this trip make any difference at all, or would it be forgotten as soon as they returned to the palace? Thomas did not know the answers to these questions. All he knew was that he had done what he believed was right. Whatever happened now was in the Queen's hands. And in his heart, despite all his doubts, he believed that she would not let her people down. He had seen the tears in her eyes. He had heard the emotion in her voice. Queen Victoria had been changed by what she had witnessed. The question was whether she was strong enough to act on it. As the lights of London appeared in the distance, the Queen finally spoke. She told Thomas that when they arrived at the palace, he should return to his normal duties and speak to no one about their journey. She needed time to think about what to do next. She needed to plan carefully, but she made him a promise. She said that his bravery would not be forgotten. His honesty would not be wasted. She would find a way to help her people. She would find a way to change the policy that would have caused so much harm. And she would find a way to make sure that voices like his could be heard. Even when they spoke truths that people in power did not want to hear, Thomas believed her. Looking into her eyes, seeing the determination there, he truly believed that Queen Victoria would keep her word. Thomas returned to his duties at Windsor Castle the next morning, but everything felt different. He stood at his post in the same uniform, in the same corridors, but he was not the same person. He had seen something in the Queen's eyes during their journey, a transformation, awakening. Now he could only wait and hope that it would lead to real change. Days passed slowly. Thomas heard nothing from the Queen. He began to worry that perhaps she had changed her mind. Perhaps her advisors had convinced her that their trip had been a foolish mistake. Perhaps the comfortable routine of Palace's life had made her forget the suffering she had witnessed in the village. The grand celebration was approaching. The day when the Queen would announce the new policy. Thomas felt sick with anxiety. If she went ahead with the announcement as planned, everything would have been for nothing. His risk would have been pointless. The people in his village would face even greater hardships. On the morning of the celebration, the castle was filled with activity. Important guests arrived in their fancy carriages. Ministers and advisors rushed through the halls with documents and last-minute preparations. The halls were decorated with flowers and banners. Everything looked perfect and beautiful. It's like the illusion the Queen's advisors had created about the state of England. Thomas was assigned to guard duty in the throne room. He stood against the wall, trying to keep his face expressionless as the room filled with nobles and politicians. They laughed and chatted, drinking expensive wine and eating fancy food. None of them seemed to have any idea what life was like for ordinary people. None of them seemed to care. Finally, Queen Victoria entered the room. Everyone fell silent and bowed. She took her place on the throne, looking every bit the powerful monarch. But Thomas noticed something different about her. Her face was set with determination. Her eyes moved slowly across the room, taking in all the wealthy, comfortable people who surrounded her. The Prime Minister stepped forward to begin the ceremony. He gave a long speech about England's prosperity and progress. He praised the Queen's wisdom and leadership. He talked about the new policy as if it were a wonderful gift that would benefit everyone. Thomas felt his heart sink. It was happening. The Queen was going to go through with it after all, but then something unexpected occurred. As the Prime Minister finished his speech and prepared to have the Queen sign the new policy into law, Victoria held up her hand. The room fell silent. Everyone looked confused. This was not part of the plan. The Queen stood up from her throne. Her voice rang out clearly across the room. She said that she had something to say before any documents were signed. The Prime Minister looked nervous. The advisors glanced at each other with worried expressions. Victoria spoke about her duty as queen. She said that her most important responsibility was to care for all of her people, not just the wealthy and powerful ones. She said that she had recently learned something troubling. She had learned that there was great suffering in parts of England that she had not seen. People were struggling to feed their families. Children were working in dangerous factories. Families were losing their homes and their hope. The nobles in the room shifted uncomfortably. Some looked annoyed, as if the queen were being improper by bringing up such unpleasant topics at a celebration. But Victoria continued, her voice growing stronger. She said that the policy they had gathered to announce today would make things worse for those who were already suffering. It would place greater burdens on the poor while providing benefits to those who least needed them. And she could not, in good conscience, allow that to happen. The room erupted in whispers. The Prime Minister looked shocked. He tried to speak, to explain that the policy had been carefully planned, that changing it now would cause problems. But the Queen raised her hand again, silencing him. She announced that she was canceling the policy. Furthermore, she was ordering a complete review of all laws and policies that affected working families. She wanted a committee formed, not of wealthy politicians and advisors, but of people who actually understood what it meant to struggle. She wanted teachers, factory workers, farmers, shopkeepers to have a voice in decisions that affected their lives. The nobles looked outraged. One lord stood up and objected loudly. He said that common people did not understand economics and policy. They could not be trusted to make important decisions. The Queen's advisors nodded in agreement, trying to support his argument. But Victoria's response was fierce. She said that the current system had failed. The people who claimed to understand economics had created a situation where children went hungry while grain rotted in warehouses, because poor families could not afford to buy it. The people who claimed to understand policy had built a society where hardworking men and women could not earn enough to keep their families warm in winter. If that was the result of expertise, then perhaps it was time to listen to different voices. Perhaps the people who lived with the consequences of these policies every day had wisdom that was worth hearing. Thomas felt tears sting his eyes as he listened. She had done it. The Queen had actually done it. She had not only stopped the harmful policy, but she was taking steps to change the entire system. She was opening doors that had been closed for generations. The Prime Minister tried one more time to object. He warned the Queen that this decision would be unpopular with powerful people. There would be resistance. Some members of Parliament would oppose her. The newspapers owned by wealthy lords would criticize her. Victoria looked at him calmly. She said that she had spent too many years worrying about being popular with powerful people. It was time to worry about being just. It was time to remember that a queen's crown came with responsibilities, not just privileges. And the most important responsibility was to protect those who could not. Protect themselves. She concluded by saying that any minister or advisor who could not support this new direction was free to resign. She would not force anyone to stay who disagreed with her vision. But she would not be moved from her decision. She had seen the truth with her own eyes, and she could not unsee it. The celebration ended in chaos. Some nobles left in anger. Others stood in groups, arguing about what the Queen had done. The Prime Minister gathered his papers with shaking hands, clearly furious but unable to challenge the Queen directly. As the room emptied, Thomas remained at his post. The Queen walked past him on her way out. For just a moment, her eyes met his. She did not speak, but she gave him the smallest nod. It was a gesture of recognition, of gratitude, of shared understanding that they had done something important together. In the days that followed, the palace was in turmoil. Several ministers did resign, just as the Queen had predicted. The newspapers were filled with opinions both supporting and attacking her decision. Some praised her compassion and courage. Others accused her of being manipulated or making emotional decisions without proper thought. But Victoria did not waver. She moved forward with her plans. She established the committee she had promised, bringing in people from all walks of life to advise on policies affecting the poor. She ordered investigations into factory conditions and housing problems. She visited hospitals and workhouses, seeing for herself the conditions that her people endured. The changes did not happen overnight. There was resistance at every step. Wealthy landowners fought against reforms that threatened their profits. Politicians who had built careers on the old system tried to slow down or block the new initiatives. But the Queen persisted. Thomas continued his duties as a guard, but his life had changed in ways he never expected. Word had spread about what he had done, though the details remained unclear to most people. Some guards treated him with respect, seeing him as brave. Others avoided him, viewing him as a troublemaker who had violated protocol. The senior guard who had tried to arrest him that day in the corridor was transferred to a different post. Thomas suspected this was the Queen's doing, removing someone who might cause him problems. He was grateful, though he never received confirmation of her involvement. One afternoon, several weeks after the cancelled celebration, Thomas received a message to report to a small sitting room in the palace. He had never been summoned there before. His heart raced as he walked through the corridors. Wondering what this meant, he entered the room and found Queen Victoria waiting for him. Mrs. Fletcher was there too, sitting quietly in the corner. The Queen invited Thomas to sit, which was itself extraordinary. Guards did not sit in the presence of royalty. Victoria thanked him formally for his service. Then she did something that shocked him. She promoted him. Not to a higher position within the guard, but to a new position she had created. He would be her liaison to the people. His job would be to travel throughout England, visiting villages and towns, talking to ordinary people and bringing their concerns directly to her. Thomas could barely find words. The Queen explained that she needed someone she could trust to tell her the truth. Someone who understood both the palace and the people. Someone who was not afraid to speak up when others stayed silent. He had proven himself to be that person. She also told him that his mother would be taken care of. The Queen had arranged for repairs to her cottage and a pension that would allow her to live comfortably for the rest of her life. His sisters would be offered better positions with fair wages. It was the Queen's way of thanking the family that had produced such an honest man. Thomas accepted the position with a full heart. As he left the sitting room, he thought about how much had changed in such a short time. He had risked everything to speak the truth, expecting to lose his career and possibly his freedom. Instead, he had helped change the course of history. The story of what happened between Thomas and the Queen was never written in official documents. The trip to the village remained a secret, known only to the few people who had been there. But the effects of that trip rippled outward, changing laws and policies, improving lives, giving hope to people who had been forgotten. Thomas understood now that this was how real change happened. Not through grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but through small acts of courage. Through one person deciding to speak up, even when it was dangerous. Through one person in power deciding to listen, even when it was uncomfortable. Through truth being told and heard, no matter how painful it might be. Thomas's new role took him all across England over the following months. He traveled to mining towns in the north, fishing villages on the coast, and farming communities in the countryside. Everywhere he went, he listened to people's stories. He took careful notes about their struggles and their hopes. And he brought these stories back to Queen Victoria. The Queen read every report Thomas wrote. She asked questions. She wanted details. She wanted to understand not just the problems, but also the people facing them. Slowly, policy by policy, law by law, things began to change. New regulations improved safety in factories. Children under 12 were no longer allowed to work in dangerous conditions. Schools received funding to repair buildings and buy books. Programs were established to help families who had lost their farms. It was not perfect, and it was not fast, but it was real progress. Thomas returned to his village 6 months after his first journey there with the Queen. He barely recognized it. The school had a new roof. The roads had been repaired. A new doctor had opened a practice offering affordable care to families who previously had no access to medical help. Most importantly, people looked different. There was something in their faces that had not been there before. Hope Mr. Whitmore was still alive, sitting on his usual bench near the well. When he saw Thomas, the old man's face lit up with a smile. He called Thomas over and shook his hand warmly. The old farmer said that he did not know exactly what Thomas had done, but he knew that somehow Things had changed after that day when Thomas had brought those visitors to the village. People were talking about how the Queen seemed different now, how she was actually listening to ordinary folk, how new laws were being passed that helped instead of hurt. Mr. Whitmore said that for the first time in years, he felt like maybe someone in power actually cared about people like him. Thomas visited his mother. Her cottage was transformed. The roof no longer leaked. The walls had been repaired and painted. There was proper heating, and the cupboards were full of food. His mother looked healthier than he had seen her in years. She wept when she hugged her son, thanking him for whatever he had done, though she did not know the full story. She told Thomas that his sisters had written. They had both received better positions, just as the Queen had promised. They were earning fair wages and working in decent conditions. For the first time, they were able to save money and dream about their futures. His whole family had been lifted out of the desperate poverty that had threatened to destroy them. But not everyone was happy with the changes. Thomas's work made him enemies among the wealthy and powerful. Some saw him as a dangerous radical who was turning the Queen against her natural allies. Others viewed him as a traitor to his class, someone who had risen from humble origins but then betrayed the system that had given him opportunities. There were attempts to discredit him. Rumors spread that he had lied to the Queen, that he had exaggerated the problems, that he had manipulated her emotions for his own gain. Some newspapers published articles attacking him, though they never mentioned him by name. They wrote about harmful influences around the Queen and common agitators who were leading her astray. The Queen ignored these attacks. She had seen the truth with her own eyes. She knew that Thomas had shown her reality, not deception. When some of her remaining advisors suggested that she dismiss Thomas to quiet the criticism, Victoria refused. She said that she would rather face criticism for doing what was right than receive praise for ignoring what was wrong. Thomas faced personal challenges too. Some of his old friends from his guard days stopped speaking to him. They thought he had gotten too big for his position, that he had forgotten where he came from. They did not understand that he was doing this work precisely because he remembered where he came from. He remembered what it felt like to be powerless and unheard. There were times when Thomas felt overwhelmed by the responsibility. Late at night, writing his reports by candlelight, he sometimes questioned whether he was really making a difference. The problems were so big, the resistance was so strong. For every step forward, there seemed to be 2 steps back. But then he would receive a letter from someone whose life had changed because of a new law. Or he would visit a village and see children playing who were healthier and happier than before. Or he would meet a family who had been able to keep their home because of assistance programs that had been established. And he would remember why he had spoken up in the first place. 2 years after that fateful day when Thomas had stepped forward in the corridor, Queen Victoria called him to the palace for a special meeting. She told him that she wanted to honor him publicly for his service. She planned to grant him a title and a position in her official court. Thomas was stunned. He had never expected or wanted recognition. He asked the Queen respectfully if he could decline the honor. Not because he was ungrateful, but because he believed his work was more important than titles. If he became part of the official court, he might lose the trust of ordinary people. They might see him as just another privileged person who had forgotten them. The Queen considered this thoughtfully. Then she agreed. She said that perhaps Thomas was right. His value came from his ability to move between worlds, to understand both the palace and the village. Making him part of the official aristocracy might indeed diminish that value. Instead, she offered him something different. She wanted to establish a permanent office, a department within the government whose job was to listen to the people and bring their voices to the Queen and Parliament. Thomas would lead this office. He would hire people from all backgrounds to travel throughout England, just as he had done, gathering stories and identifying problems that needed attention. Thomas accepted this role with gratitude. Over the next several years, he built the department into something powerful and effective. He hired former factory workers, teachers, farmers, and shopkeepers. People who understood struggle because they had lived it. People who could talk to ordinary citizens and be trusted because they were ordinary citizens themselves. The department faced constant opposition from those who saw it as a threat to their power, but it also had the Queen's complete support, and that made all the difference. Slowly but steadily, it changed how England was governed. Laws could no longer be passed without considering their impact on working families. Policies had to be explained and justified to people who actually understood real life, not just economic theories. Thomas never forgot Mr. Whitmore's words about hope. He understood that the most important thing he could give people was not just better laws or improved conditions, but the belief that their voices mattered, that they were seen and heard, that they were not invisible or forgotten. As Thomas grew older, he trained others to continue the work. He found young people with courage and compassion, people who were willing to speak truth to power even when it was dangerous. He taught them that real service meant being honest, even when honesty was uncomfortable, especially when it was uncomfortable. Queen Victoria never forgot what Thomas had taught her. In her later years, she often spoke about the importance of listening to voices that might be difficult to hear. She encouraged her successors to remember that a monarch's duty was to all the people, not just the wealthy and powerful ones. The official history books did not record the story of Thomas Bennet in his secret journey with the Queen. There were no statues erected in his honor. No grand ceremonies celebrated his courage. But in villages throughout England, people told stories about how things had changed, how someone had finally told the truth, how the Queen had finally listened. Thomas lived to be an old man. He never became wealthy or famous, but he died knowing that he had made a difference. He had taken a terrible risk to speak up when it mattered most. And that single act of courage had rippled outward, changing thousands of lives. On his last day, surrounded by his family in a comfortable home that the Queen's pension had provided, Thomas thought back to that morning in the corridor. The moment when he had stepped forward and broken all the rules. The moment when he had chosen truth over safety. He had been so afraid that day. His hands had trembled. His voice had almost failed him. But he had spoken anyway. And in doing so, he had proven something important. He had proven that one person really could make a difference. That ordinary people had extraordinary power when they found the courage to use it. The guard who told Queen Victoria the truth became a man who changed history. Not through violence or grand gestures, but through the simple act of being honest when everyone else stayed silent. His story was forgotten by the official records, but it lived on in the better world he helped create. In the children who went to school instead of factories, in the families who had enough food to eat, in the hope that replaced despair. And perhaps that was the greatest legacy of all. Not to be remembered in books, but to be felt in the lives of people who never knew his name but benefited from his courage. Thomas Bennet had shown that truth was powerful, that compassion could change systems, that one voice, speaking up at the right moment, could echo through generations. His story reminds us all that we do not have to accept injustice just because it is comfortable or convenient for those in power. We do not have to stay silent when we see others suffering. We have the power to speak up, to demand better, to tell the truth, even when it costs us something. The question is not whether we have that power. The question is whether we will have the courage to use it. Just as Thomas did on that foggy morning when he stepped forward and changed everything.